April 1st, 1945. Dawn rose over Okinawa like a wounded eye. The entire horizon glowing red from the naval bombardment that had thundered through the night. Battleships pounded the shore with such ferocity that the sea itself seemed to recoil from the blast. Inside the limestone cliffs, Japanese soldiers of the 32nd Army huddled against shaking tunnel walls. Each man silently acknowledging that this island, this last gate before mainland Japan, would demand everything they had left. No retreat, no surrender, just survival against an ocean of fire. Out at sea, Marines packed into landing craft waited for the ramps to drop. The air was thick with the taste of salt and cordite. Some whispered prayers. Others stared into the smoke where the coastline should have been. When the signal flare rose, dozens of landing craft surged forward through waves churned by days of bombardment. Machine gun fire erupted from unseen cliffs, ripping into the surf. The water around the Marines exploded into chaotic bursts as they leapt out, pushing toward a shoreline they could barely see. The beach greeted them with unrestrained violence. Mortar detonated in rapid succession, throwing sand and blood into the air. Marines dug behind shattered obstacles, pressing their helmets into the mud as machine gun rounds tore the earth inches above their heads. The first wave struggled to form any line. Every attempt was shattered by sudden eruptions of gunfire from cleverly concealed firing ports. The air turned thick with smoke and dust, making every breath feel like swallowing fire. Inside the caves above them, Japanese defenders fought to keep their positions operational. Lanterns flickered as shockwaves rattled the tunnels, knocking helmets from hooks and spilling ammunition crates. Officers shouted orders over the rumbling walls, ordering troops to rotate firing positions between multiple cave mouths. The defenders fired in short, calculated bursts, conserving every bullet. They knew the Americans outnumbered them, but they also knew the terrain better than anyone alive, and they intended to use every inch of it docked just offshore. The sky split open as kamikaze pilots began their desperate descent. Dozens of Japanese Zero fighters dove toward the American fleet, engines screaming. Sailors on the decks of USS Laffey and USS Bush opened fire, tracer rounds streaking upward. But several aircraft broke through the defensive curtain, slamming into destroyers with catastrophic explosions. One kamikaze struck near a fuel line, engulfing the deck in flames that leapt higher than the mast. The shock wave rolled across the water, momentarily deafening Marines still fighting to reach the beach. On the sand, Sherman tanks pushed inland through thick mud, their engines straining as they climbed over shattered barricades. Japanese anti-tank crews, hidden behind reinforced log bunkers, fired armor-piercing rounds that sparked violently off the Sherman hulls. One tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from its turret as the crew bailed out under heavy rifle fire. The battle shifted rapidly between armored dominance and sudden vulnerability. Every movement contested by defenders who seemed to appear from the earth itself. As the Marines advanced toward the first ridgeline, Japanese infantry launched a sudden counterattack. Soldiers burst from spider holes, bayonets fixed, screaming as they charged downhill. The Marines opened fire, the jungle erupting in flashes of muzzle light. Men collided in brutal hand-to-hand combat, slipping in mud turned dark from blood. The cries of the wounded echoed between the trees, mingling with the harsh metallic clang of rifle butts smashing against helmets. The ridge itself was a fortress carved directly into the mountain. Machine guns were mounted behind overlapping layers of stone and metal, each position protected by another. Mortar were fired from recessed pits, invisible until the shells they launched burst overhead. The Marines called in flamethrower teams. Fire roared across the trench lines, its glow illuminating terrified Japanese soldiers retreating deeper into tunnels. The heat warped metal, scorched roots, and sent thick smoke billowing skyward like a funeral pyre. The entrance to one large cave erupted outward when American engineers detonated a satchel charge at its mouth. Rocks tumbled downhill as Marines stormed in with flashlights and bayonets. The cave was a labyrinth, narrow passages, steep drops, sudden turns. Japanese soldiers ambushed them from behind stone alcoves, dragging attackers into hidden shafts. The fighting devolved into frantic close-quarter strikes, echoing through darkness thick with dust. Farther inland, the terrain transformed into a maze of ravines and ridges. Japanese artillery hidden in concealed chambers fired point-blank at advancing infantry. Shells exploded so close that Marines felt the percussion slam into their bodies like a physical blow. Reinforcements struggled to climb upward through mud slicked by days of rain and blood. Every step forward cost more lives, every meter claimed only through overwhelming force and grim determination. A storm rolled in by mid-afternoon, turning the battlefield into a morass of soaked earth and smoke. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Japanese riflemen used the fog to reposition silently between trenches. The Marines, drenched and exhausted, pushed forward through waterlogged craters, their boots sinking ankle-deep into mud. Every rustle in the brush kept nerves stretched tight, every misplaced shadow a potential ambush dotted dusk. The Americans reached the outer defenses of the Shuri Line, Okinawa's most fortified stronghold. The cliffs rose like jagged teeth, marked with dozens of cave mouths and firing ports. Mortar rained continuously, shattering rocks into shards that tore through exposed flesh. The Marines dug foxholes wherever they could, aware that nightfall offered no refuge. The Japanese were known to launch night assaults with terrifying precision. Sure enough, as darkness settled, Japanese soldiers emerged in small groups and attempted to infiltrate Marine lines. Some crawled through grass with knives clenched between their teeth. Others hurled grenades before disappearing into the shadows. The Marines responded with flares that lit the battlefield in sudden bursts of ghostly white. Each flare revealed twisted bodies, shattered helmets, and soldiers frozen in desperate poses. Through the night, artillery pounded the ridge. The thunderous blast illuminated the sky like storms of fire. Marines clung to their positions, shielding their faces from flying debris. Behind them, medical corpsmen worked tirelessly, dragging wounded men into makeshift shelters. The air stank of antiseptic, blood, and burning wood. No one slept. No one dared to close their eyes for longer than a heartbeat dot by morning. Rainwater pooled in foxholes. The ground trembled as Japanese heavy guns resumed firing from deep within the Shuri tunnels. Engineers brought in demolition charges, preparing to assault the inner fortifications. These caves were infamous, long networks stretching miles, housing hospitals, command posts, and ambush sites. The Marines braced themselves, knowing the fight ahead would be far worse than anything they had faced so far. The first tunnel they breached led into a vast, underground chamber lit by smoldering lanterns. Japanese machine gunners opened fire instantly, bullets ricocheting off stone walls. The confined space amplified the noise into a deafening roar. Marines threw grenades, their explosions shaking loose clouds of dust. When the firing finally stopped, the chamber was a haze of smoke, rubble, and bodies. It was only the first of dozens dot. As they pushed deeper, the tunnels narrowed, forcing Marines to crawl on hands and knees. Japanese defenders fought savagely from hidden alcoves, thrusting bayonets forward before disappearing in the side passages. Flashlights flickered over desperate faces, American and Japanese alike, locked in a struggle for inches. The air grew hot and stale, and the walls seemed to pulse with the vibrations of explosions above. Outside the tunnels, Shermans advanced across open farmland. They were immediately targeted by concealed anti-tank mines. One tank erupted in a fireball, the turret thrown several meters into the air. Surviving crew members stumbled out engulfed in smoke, their shouts drowned by distant artillery. The Japanese defenders fought like men who believed dying here would protect their families. Back home, Marines continued clearing ridge after ridge, trench after trench. The village outskirts were reduced to rubble, with shattered walls still smoldering from earlier bombardments. Japanese snipers fired from hidden rafters and collapsed roofs, picking off Marines who exposed themselves for even a second. Every building had to be cleared room by room, often with brutal close combat that left both sides exhausted and terrified. By the end of the fifth day, the Americans had advanced only a few miles inland. The cost was staggering. The Japanese still held the Shuri line, and their tunnels remained deadly. But the defenders were weakening. Ammunition was scarce, supplies dwindled, and wounded soldiers filled underground chambers. Above ground, Marines stood battered, filthy, and hollow-eyed. They did not know it yet, but they were approaching the point where this brutal battle would turn and surrender would begin. By the 7th week of fighting, the Shuri line finally began to crack. Continuous rain turned trenches into rivers of sludge, and starvation hollowed Japanese faces to nothing. Corpses piled inside tunnels where medicine ran out weeks earlier. Marines advancing through the final ridges noticed fewer gunshots and more eerie silence. When they breached another cave entrance, expecting ambush, they instead found wounded Japanese soldiers lying against the walls, too weak to stand. Their rifles remained beside them, but none reached for them. Inside one of the deeper Shuri caverns, the stench of infection hit like a wall. Lanterns dimly illuminated rows of injured Japanese troops, some missing limbs, others wrapped in dirty bandages soaked with days-old blood. A Marine medic instinctively raised his hands to show peace. Several Japanese soldiers trembled, expecting execution. One young lieutenant, barely more than a teenager, whispered, "Owari da." "It's over." His voice cracked with a mixture of relief and shame. No one fired a shot. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Dozens of Japanese soldiers emerged from ruined trenches, with white scraps tied to stick shirts, bandages, even pages ripped from diaries. Marines kept rifles ready, but lowered their posture as the surrendering soldiers approached slowly, heads bowed. Some Japanese men collapsed the moment they reached American lines, unable to continue. Others knelt in mud, offering canteens or photos of their families as gestures of sincerity. It was the first large surrender of the battle. Further south, Marines discovered a system of tunnels untouched by days of fighting. When they entered, they heard quiet crying echoing from deep within. Flashlights revealed Japanese civilian women huddled against the stone walls, many still wearing nurse armbands. Their faces were pale with fear, assuming Americans would harm them. One woman shielded 2 small boys with her body. When Marines approached, she braced for violence, but the Americans spoke softly, lowering their weapons. The women remained frozen, confused by gentleness. A Japanese doctor stumbled from behind a curtain of blankets strung across the cave wall. He was skeletal, his coat stained with dried blood, hands trembling from exhaustion. When he realized the Americans weren't there to kill them, his entire posture collapsed in relief. He bowed repeatedly before guiding Marines to a crude medical station filled with injured civilians and soldiers. The Marines called for corpsmen immediately. It was the first moment of genuine cooperation between both sides. As Marines escorted civilians outside, the women flinched at sunlight for the first time in weeks. Many could barely walk, legs trembling from hunger. The Americans handed out rations, crackers, chocolate bars, small cans of fruit. The children devoured them instantly. One girl burst into tears mid-bite, overwhelmed by the taste of real sugar. The women bowed repeatedly, unsure whether this compassion was temporary or real. The battlefield around them still smoked, reminders of the horrors they had survived. Back at a secure clearing, Japanese posts were assembled under watch. Some sat silently, staring at the ground. Others whispered prayers, fearing torture. Marines distributed water and blankets, maintaining order without cruelty. Several Poles stared in disbelief as wounded Japanese soldiers were treated by American medics. One sergeant muttered, "Why? Why would they help us?" His confusion echoed through the group. Everything they had been told about Americans was collapsing. Reports soon reached Marine commanders that more civilians were trapped in hillside bunkers. Rescue teams navigated collapsed tunnels, calling out in Japanese with the help of Korean-American interpreters. Women emerged holding infants wrapped in cloth. Elderly men limped behind them, leaning on wooden sticks. The Marines guided them carefully down the slopes while artillery thundered elsewhere. Every rescue civilian added weight to the emotional complexity of the Battle of Okinawa was no longer just a military operation. It had become a humanitarian crisis. Not all encounters went smoothly. In one bunker, civilians panicked when Marines approached, believing Americans would do worse than the Japanese military had warned. A young woman attempted to flee deeper into the tunnel, but collapsed from exhaustion. When a Marine reached to help her, she screamed and curled into a ball. Only after an interpreter reassured her for several minutes did she allow herself to be guided outside. Trauma hung in the air like smoke. Meanwhile, remnants of the Japanese 32nd Army attempted a final organized retreat toward the southern cliffs. Demoralized officers urged their men to keep fighting, but most soldiers were too starving to hold rifles. Many surrendered without resistance. Others walked silently toward American lines, faces blank, accepting defeat with a heavy dignity shaped by years of propaganda and duty. The battle was effectively over, but the psychological weight lingered over everyone, Americans and Japanese alike. At dusk, Marines established a field station where Japanese posed and civilians were processed. The atmosphere was strangely calm. A Japanese mother clutched her baby tightly as a corpsman examined the child. A teenage Japanese soldier stared in disbelief as an American Marine wrapped a clean bandage around his arm. "Why?" he whispered in broken English. The Marine shrugged. "War's over for you, kid." For many Poes, it was the first time they felt safe in months. As night fell, lanterns illuminate rows of resting Poes under temporary shelters. Some slept immediately, bodies collapsing from pure exhaustion. Others stayed awake, staring at the stars, unable to comprehend survival. Nearby, Marine guards sat in the mud eating rations, speaking quietly so as not to disturb the newly captured prisoners. Even the jungle insects seemed quieter than usual, as if the island itself were catching its breath after months of suffering. A group of Japanese nurses stayed beside the wounded, refusing to leave their patients, even in surrender. Marines brought them clean towels, water, and medical supplies. One nurse bowed deeply, tears streaming down her face, whispering "Arigato." Her gratitude stunned the Marines, who had expected hatred, not relief. The simple humanity of the moment cut through the brutality that had defined the battle. Even hardened soldiers found themselves looking away to hide emotion. Later that evening, a senior Japanese officer, dirty, wounded, exhausted, approached American lines carrying a tattered white cloth. His hands trembled as he surrendered his sword. Marines accepted it solemnly. He then bowed deeply and requested medical aid for the civilians still hiding in nearby caves. The Americans sent a rescue team immediately. The officer collapsed to his knees, relieved that anyone, had finally listened. The rescue team found dozens more civilians trapped behind a rockfall. Working through the night, Marines cleared debris with bare hands, lantern light flickering against their sweat-covered faces. When the final stone was removed, children crawled through first, followed by elderly women clutching rosaries. A Marine lifted one frail grandmother into his arms, her weight barely more than a child's. She touched his cheek gently, whispering thanks. It was a moment that transcended language. By sunrise, the hillside had transformed. Where caves once hid fear and violence, now groups of civilians and Poes gathered quietly under makeshift tarps. Coffee boiled over small stoves. Medics distributed blankets and checked wounds. The women who had once expected death now watched their children eat warm food. Japanese soldiers, formerly enemies, sat side by side with Marines, exhausted but alive. The war's brutality still echoed, but humanity began stitching itself back together further south. Marines reached the final cliffs where the last Japanese holdouts had taken refuge. Instead of fighting, many stepped forward unarmed, bowing with tears streaming down their faces. One soldier clutched a photo of his family, holding it out as surrender. The Marines guided them gently to the collection point. For the first time since landing, the Americans advanced without gunfire. The silence felt almost unreal. Word spread quickly among Poes that civilians were being fed and treated well. Fear slowly melted into curiosity. A young Japanese woman approached the Marine cook tent, hesitating before pointing to a pot of soup. The cook, smiling, handed her a bowl. She bowed deeply, unsure how to express the overwhelming mix of relief and disbelief. Around her, the other civilians watched cautiously. Reassured by her bravery. In the afternoon, rain returned gentle this time, washing blood and soot from the ground. Marines set up additional shelters for families, while Poes assisted by carrying supplies and guiding wounded civilians. Cooperation, once unimaginable, became natural. A Marine handed a chocolate bar to a shy little girl who laughed for the first time since emerging from the tunnels. Her laughter echoed across the quiet hillside, breaking the heaviness that had gripped the island. When night finally fell, Okinawa felt transformed. Fires no longer burned. Gunfire no longer echoed. Instead, the soft murmur of conversation filled the air. Marines speaking with Poes, nurses tending the injured, children curled safely beneath blankets. The long, brutal battle had ended not with a final explosion, but with an unexpected harmony. And as lanterns flickered across the hills, it became clear that the island had witnessed something rare in war. The moment enemies laid down fear and rebuilt humanity together.